empirically, as a political scientist, the United States of America is one of the least racist countries on earth. I mean, this is not very disputed data. It actually, World Population Review, in my opinion, stopped running this information a couple of years ago during the national mental meltdown following the death of Mr. Floyd because of the implications of this sort of plain fact. But I mean, every year there's surveys where well-trained social scientists, and I'd imagine the major universities of the world, in urban areas that you'd expect to be more tolerant than the average, simply ask people how they would feel about having a neighbor of a different race or caste. You know, is this something you'd object to? This is totally anonymous. I'll look up the details of the project after the call, but it's very well done. It's universally accepted in my field. And the United States of America invariably is one of the countries where the smallest number of people would object to a neighbor of a different race, religion, anything similar. And this is part of a general pattern, actually, where 94% of Americans support interracial marriage. That's true across whites and blacks. I mean, so on down the line. So yeah, we're not the most racist country in the world. We're one of the least.
I have experienced this anecdotally, which is when you travel, and it's, the ironic thing is when you travel to places like Scandinavia,
Okay.
the kind of like racism that you encounter is so much more overt, it's almost shocking to you.
Yep.
Compared to here in the States. Or Japan, which I haven't been to, but I have many friends who've spent time in Japan, and they're like, oh, Japan is just, it's overt. And it does seem like where you have very homogenous populations, you just tend to have people who are more overtly racist, more overtly like worried and afraid of people that don't look like them. And then you come to America, where we're a melting pot, and we're used to getting on a subway or going to a grocery store and seeing lots of different types of people and being okay with it. And yet we have this narrative that we are uniquely horrible, that we were sort of born in 1619. And this is permeating our education system. I know your book, your upcoming book is called The Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You. And this feels like one of them. This feels like one of those lies that our kids are being told, that we are this uniquely racist country. So that's one example of how we're not. You just ask people around the world, what else should I as a parent help my kid understand about race in America so that they don't fall into this trap?
Well, there are a lot of different points here. I mean, so first, to engage the main thing you said, I mean, yeah, like most nations are far more overtly racist than the United States. And this isn't just true of white nations, by the way. I mean, so like when you mentioned Japan, the Japanese word for foreigner is still gaijin. I mean, you see this in, anime comic books. Gaijin means foreign devil. And that's extremely, extremely common. The Chinese word for foreigner used for both whites and blacks is guailofan. Excuse my pronunciation, but that means barbarian dog, if I recall correctly. The experience with whites, certainly, probably with black Ethiopians or whatever as well, would have been foreign warriors that were viewed as a bit below those of the Middle Kingdom, much less its elegant, silk-clad diplomats. So, I mean, this is an extremely common attitude. You see this as well in the traditionally, historically powerful black nations, Arabic nations. I mean, there's a famous meme, you see this on Facebook and Twitter, of an Asian American who went to, I believe, Nigeria to help the local black population. And when he got there, he found that Nigeria is a rising, top 30 global economy, and that he was greeted with constant racism. So the image in the meme is like all these black kids pulling their eyes to the side so they can, quote unquote, look Chinese to tease him. It's a whole soccer field doing it. And the guy's like,
I've
what?
not seen this.
It's, I don't know what you'd search for to find it, try to think of something politically correct. But I mean, it's just, that is extremely, extremely common everywhere outside of what some people call the weird zone, the Anglosphere, basically. It's partly due to homogeneity, but even in very heterogeneous countries like Mexico and India, people openly refer to each other as backward caste or lazy forward caste. In Mexico, Chino, Negro, Blanco, people's nicknames mean things like Chinaman. So we have, because of a combination of everything from our civil rights laws to post-British Victorian era politeness, to just extreme diversity. We've mentioned some of the cities in the country. We've come past that. And yes, that absolutely should be recognized. It should be recognized as something whites, blacks, everyone else sacrificed to do. And so the narrative that comes in counter to that, the 1619 narrative, is primarily false. The reason it's false is not even so much that the things that it says, like there used to be a great deal of ethnic conflict in the USA, are inaccurate. It's that they are kind of the 33 degrees of knowledge that was always associated with foolishness or with the devil in European mythology. The assumption is that someone who is listening won't know that Asia, Africa, Arabia, so on were much worse. That's the great caveat here. We had slaves. Well, everyone had slaves. We helped the world free them. It was the US and the UK that literally armed their navies and blockaded whole countries like Zanzibar to end the global trade in slaves. We ended the international slave trade in the USA in 1808. So, I mean, not being aware of that, only being aware of our warts in the context of what being warts and all means is a foolish approach. Also, a lot of the things said in traditions like that simply are not true. I mean, the idea that the United States began in 1619, slavery didn't begin in the United States until, and I talk about this in Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, but until almost 50 years after that. I mean, when Anthony Johnson and the first black, Aravistes to the USA got here, they were indentured servants. Slavery hadn't yet been formally implemented as a practice. Slavery, of course, is servitude that you can't leave. But the general idea was that if you were a black servant, just as if you were a white servant, you were going to be in bondage for maybe 10 years. Then you were going to be, you'd lost the war, it was going to suck. But then you were going to be released. You were going to, in many cases, be given some land, and you would have the opportunity to buy both black and white servants. So, I mean, when I mentioned the name Anthony Johnson, the first slave owner in the United States, many people would say, was a black man. He was an Angolan sort of lower chieftain captured by the Portuguese during the incessant fighting that existed for males in particular of every group during this period. He was brought to the United States, brought to the Commonwealth of Virginia. He suffered his time as an indentured servant, which is absolutely miserable for almost everyone in these roles. People weren't actually taught to be blacksmiths or something like that. They were used as essentially enslaved farm labor for the length of those contracts, which are often 23 years. His was 10. But he was then released. He ended up getting married, fighting the Indians with his white neighbors, so on. And the case that settled legal American slavery actually involved another man, I think John Kotsur, who was his bond servant who tried to run away. And Johnson argued that recalcitrant bond servants should be kept permanently by the people who owned them, as I recall the matter. And so he became, there may have been one or two before him in other states, but the first American slave owner. And we're talking about the 1650s, 1660s here. So the 1619 Project idea itself is wrong. Slavery in its full form didn't exist at that time. And the United States, I'll note, also didn't exist. The USA began in 1776. So we had slavery in America from 1776 to 1865. That's it. I mean, it's a shameful, unfortunate block of time, but it's worth comparing that to the entire global sweep of the exact same practice. What should you tell your kids? Which is, I think, your real question. You should tell them all this and more. I mean, I would strongly encourage you to buy what used to be considered just conventional history books. And books in general, from Jared Diamond to Charles Murray, that everyone used to read through about 2010, and have them in a library in your house and just communicate this information. There's not much more to be said than that.
If you like this clip, we've got more where that came from. Be sure to watch the full video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our new videos as they come out each week.